The air was heavy as I stood in the doorway, watching the life I'd built collapse before my eyes. My wife, Laura, sat across the room, her face pale and trembling under the weight of the truth I'd uncovered. Beside her, my daughter Sandy avoided my gaze, her own guilt etched into her features. 20 years of love, sacrifice, and trust shattered in a single evening. The photos, the lies, the betrayal, it was all too much. You both knew, I said, my voice cold and firm. And yet, you chose him. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my footsteps as I walked away, leaving them to face the consequences of their choices. But before we dive deeper into the story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on the next one. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the half-empty living room. Dave methodically packed the last of his belongings into the car, his hands steady despite the storm raging inside him. The house, once filled with laughter and life, was eerily silent. His steps echoed as he walked back and forth, placing each box with care, as though the act of organizing the chaos could somehow soothe his fractured soul. In the dim light, the packed boxes seemed to hold more than just clothes and keepsakes. They carried the weight of 20 years. He paused for a moment, his breath visible in the cool evening air. The house stood still, a hollow shell of memories that no longer belonged to him. I didn't plan for it to end this way. His voice cracked, almost inaudible, as if confessing to the silence. 20 years of love, sacrifice, and trust, reduced to this moment. A packed car, a broken heart, and a home that no longer feels like mine. Behind him, a voice broke the stillness. "Dad," Sandy called, standing hesitantly in the doorway. Her eyes darted from the boxes to his face. "Where are you going? Why didn't you come to the rehearsal?" Dave turned to her, his expression calm but distant. For a moment, he studied her as though memorizing her features. Her curly hair, her wide eyes that used to light up when she saw him. "I thought you'd figured it out by now," he said evenly, his voice stripped of anger but filled with finality. Her lips parted to speak, but no words came. She looked as though she wanted to ask him to stay, to explain, to fix what had been broken, but the weight of her silence said enough. The laughter of a toddler filled the air, the kind of pure, joyful sound that could make anyone forget their troubles. Dave remembered that moment vividly. Sandy, no older than 2, toddling towards him with her arms outstretched. He'd crouched down, scooping her into his arms as Laura looked on, her smile wide and genuine. "That's my big girl," he had said, spinning Sandy in circles until she squealed with delight. Those early days were golden. He had stepped into their lives during a stormy time, when Laura had been left to pick up the pieces after her husband walked out. Sandy was so young, she didn't even remember her biological father. Dave had become her rock, her protector, the man who showed up when others didn't. Family dinners around the old oak table were warm and full of life. Laura cooked, Sandy giggled, and Dave told stories that made them both laugh until their sides hurt. On vacations, Sandy would cling to his hand as they walked along the beach, her little footprints trailing behind his. The montage of memories played in his mind like a bittersweet movie. "I stepped into this family 20 years ago," he thought, his grip tightening on the steering wheel as the present came rushing back. Laura had just been abandoned by her husband, and little Sandy didn't even remember her father. I became their rock, their protector. But those golden days were long gone, tarnished by secrets and lies. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped being enough. The living room was buzzing with excitement. Laura and Sandy sat on the couch, their heads bent together over a stack of wedding brochures. Swatches of fabric, invitation samples, and menu options were spread across the coffee table. Their voices overlapped, full of anticipation and joy. Dave sat in the corner, his chair angled just enough to feel excluded, but not far enough to avoid hearing every word. He sipped his coffee, the warmth of the mug doing little to thaw the cold weight settling in his chest. "John wants to give a toast at the wedding," Laura said, her tone casual but with a hint of something that felt like pride. She glanced at Sandy, who beamed. Dave's cup paused midair. His jaw tightened, but he forced himself to speak. "Your ex-husband is sweet now?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, but Laura brushed it off with a light laugh. "Oh, Dave, don't be like that," Sandy chimed in, her tone firm, but tinged with that familiar edge of impatience she'd developed over the years. "Dad, he's just trying to reconnect. It's not a big deal." Dave's eyes flicked between them, his grip tightening on the cup. "Reconnect," he echoed, his voice cold but steady. "He abandoned you, both of you, and now he's a hero because he wants to give a toast?" Laura looked at him then, her smile faltering slightly. For a fleeting moment there was something in her eyes, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of the man who had been there when John wasn't. But just as quickly she turned back to Sandy, brushing aside his words like lint on her sleeve. "Anyway," Laura said, her voice bright again, "John was saying the funniest thing about—" Dave tuned out the rest. He couldn't stomach it. His gaze drifted to the table where a picture of the three of them from years ago sat in a silver frame. Back then, it had been so easy to believe in the family they'd built, in the bond they shared. Now, that connection felt like a thread stretched to its breaking point. John was larger than life, he thought bitterly, swooping in with his flash car and smooth talk. To them, he was the prodigal father. To me, he was a thief, stealing the family I'd built. Their laughter pulled him back to the present. Laura and Sandy were doubled over, caught in some shared joke about John's latest antics. Dave's stomach churned as he forced a smile, though the muscles in his face ached with the effort. They didn't notice. They never did anymore. He shifted in his seat, setting his cup down a little harder than he meant to. The sound was swallowed by their chatter. His frustration simmered just beneath the surface, a quiet, boiling rage he couldn't release. "Dad?" Sandy said suddenly, turning to him with a look of faint annoyance. "You'll still walk me down the aisle, right?" For a moment he couldn't answer. The words stuck in his throat, trapped between love for his daughter and the bitterness clawing at his insides. Finally, he nodded. "Of course," he said, his voice hollow. She smiled, satisfied, and turned back to Laura, who was already talking about floral arrangements. Dave leaned back in his chair, the invisible wall between him and the two most important people in his life growing higher with every passing moment. The house was quiet that evening, with only the faint hum of the refrigerator breaking the stillness. Dave was rummaging through the kitchen counter drawers, searching for his car keys. They weren't there. Frustrated, he moved into the living room, where Laura's purse sat on the side table. Without a second thought, he reached inside, knowing she often tossed his keys in there after errands. His fingers brushed against something unfamiliar, small, plastic, and crinkly. He pulled it out, his brow furrowing. It was a strip of condoms. A wave of confusion swept over him, quickly followed by a sinking feeling in his stomach. He stood there, frozen, staring at the item in his hand as if it might explain itself. It didn't. "What's this?" he finally asked, his voice steady but sharp enough to cut through the silence. Laura, walking into the room with a glass of wine, stopped in her tracks. Her eyes flickered to the strip in his hand, widening for the briefest of moments before she quickly forced a smile. "Oh," she said, her laugh tight and unnatural. "It's for a gag gift at the reception. You know, one of those silly bridal party games." Dave didn't respond immediately. He watched her carefully, his mind racing. Her laugh didn't feel like the kind of laugh you gave when you were amused. It felt forced, calculated. And the way she avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the wine glass in her hand, it was all wrong. I wanted to believe her, he thought, the words repeating like a mantra in his head. I really did, but something about her tone, the nervous laugh, the way she avoided my eyes, set off alarms I couldn't ignore. Still, he said nothing. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Laura turned and walked into the kitchen, her casual demeanor too practiced to be genuine. Dave put the condoms back into her purse, his hands moving on autopilot while his mind struggled to make sense of it. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. He found his keys and left for the grocery store, but the image of the condom stayed with him, playing over and over in his mind like a bad movie he couldn't turn off. Later that evening, he sat in his chair in the living room, the television on but muted. Laura was across the room, scrolling through her phone. Her face lit up briefly as a call came in, the screen glowing against her features. For a moment, she stared at the name on the display, her thumb hovering uncertainly over the screen. Then, just as quickly, she turned the phone face down on the couch and let it go to voicemail. The music was playing, face down on the couch and let it go to voicemail. Dave watched her out of the corner of his eye. She didn't know he'd noticed, but he saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand twitched, as though resisting the urge to pick up the phone. The same unease he'd felt earlier when he found the condoms began to creep back, wrapping around him like a cold mist. Questions swirled in his mind, unrelenting and unanswered. Who was calling her? Why did she ignore it? Why did she look so guilty? It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. Dave didn't say anything, but his thoughts churned long into the night, a storm building inside him. Something was wrong. He didn't know what yet, but he was certain something was very, very wrong. The cafe was dimly lit, with flickering neon signs outside casting uneven patterns on the walls. Dave sat at a corner table, his hands folded tightly around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the door, as if bracing himself for what was about to come. He had never imagined this would be his life, sitting in a dingy cafe, waiting for answers he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. The investigator arrived, a man in his 50s with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanor. He slid into the seat across from Dave, placing a folder on the table between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet hum of the cafe filled the air. "You were right to be suspicious," the investigator said finally, his voice low and matter-of-fact. "She's been meeting him at a motel." The words hit like a punch to the gut, but Dave didn't flinch. He nodded once, his expression carefully controlled, though his hands tightened around the coffee cup until his knuckles turned white. "Show me," he said. The investigator opened the folder, sliding a stack of photos across the table. Dave hesitated before picking them up. The first picture showed Laura, smiling, stepping out of her car in the motel parking lot. The next was worse. Her face lit up with laughter as John held the door open for her. Each image told a story he didn't want to read, but he couldn't stop turning them over, one by one. Hearing it was one thing, he thought, his chest tightening with each photo. Seeing the photos, Laura laughing as she entered John's room, was another. He set the stack down, his hands trembling slightly despite his effort to stay composed. "How long?" he asked, his voice strained but steady. "Couple of weeks at least," the investigator replied. "Could be longer, but this is what I've got so far." Dave leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. His mind raced, searching for an explanation that didn't feel like a betrayal. But the images were clear, and so was the sinking feeling in his gut. There was no misunderstanding this. "She's not the first, you know," the investigator continued, pulling Dave out of his thoughts. "This guy, John, he's got a pattern. Women like Laura, they're his type. He swoops in, makes them feel special, then leaves them high and dry when he's gotten what he wanted." Dave's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" The investigator leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "John's been in and out of a lot of lives. Couple of marriages, few long-term affairs. He's good at what he does, makes them feel like they're the only one in the world. Then, when they're hooked, he moves on, usually with a lot of their money or whatever else he can get." Dave stared at the investigator, the weight of his words sinking in. It was like a puzzle coming together, each piece fitting perfectly into the picture he had been dreading. John wasn't just a mistake. He was a predator. For a moment, Dave said nothing. His gaze dropped back to the photos on the table, the laughter on Laura's face cutting deeper than anything the investigator had said. "What do I do with this?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's up to you," the investigator replied, sliding the folder back toward him. "But now you know." Dave sat there long after the investigator left, the photos still in front of him. The answers he'd sought had come, but they brought no comfort, only pain. As he left the cafe, the weight of the truth pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. The storm brewing in his chest had reached its peak. It was no longer a question of whether things would change. It was only a matter of when. Dave sat on the edge of the worn leather couch, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tightly together. Sandy sat across from him, her arms folded protectively across her chest. The tension in the room was thick, the air heavy with unspoken words. "Well, don't you just say it, Dad," Sandy finally muttered, avoiding his gaze. Her voice was defensive, but her hands trembled slightly where they gripped her elbows. Dave took a deep breath, his voice low but steady. "You knew about your mother and John, didn't you?" Sandy's head snapped up, her eyes wide and brimming with tears. She stammered, then looked away, her defenses crumbling. "I thought it was harmless," she blurted, her voice shaking. "He's my real dad, and Mom just seemed so happy." Dave's stomach twisted. He had expected anger, denial, anything but this. Her words hit him like a punch, the weight of them settling heavily in his chest. "Harmless," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "You thought this was harmless?" "I didn't know it would go this far," Sandy cried, tears streaming down her face now. "I just wanted to give him a chance. He's my father, Dad. Don't you understand? Mom seemed like she was alive again, and I—" "Stop," Dave interrupted, his tone cold and cutting. Sandy flinched, the room falling silent except for her quiet sobs. "You knew, and you said nothing." Sandy buried her face in her hands, her words muffled but still audible. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to hurt you, but I didn't want to push him away either. He's trying, Dad. He's trying to make up for everything." Dave leaned back, running a hand over his face. The exhaustion, the betrayal, and now this. It was almost too much to bear. "Do you know what he's really doing?" he asked, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" "Huh?" Sandy looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with confusion. "What are you talking about?" "He's not here to reconnect," Dave said firmly. "He's here because he's done this before. He uses people, women like your mother, families like ours, and when he's done, he leaves them with nothing." Sandy shook her head, denial flashing in her eyes. "That's not true. You don't know him." "I know enough," Dave cut in, his voice like steel. "And so do you, whether you want to admit it or not." The silence between them stretched uncomfortably until Sandy finally broke it, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom's spending the night with him tomorrow, before the wedding." Dave froze, her words sinking in like a dagger. "What?" he asked, though he had heard her clearly. "She said she wanted to talk to him to sort things out," Sandy explained, her voice shaking again. "I didn't know how to stop her." Dave stood abruptly, his movements sharp and controlled. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in around him. Without another word, he walked to the door, leaving Sandy behind in tears. As he stepped outside, the cold night air hit him like a slap, but it did nothing to clear the storm raging in his mind. There was no turning back now. Whatever illusion of family he had been holding onto was gone. The hum of the car engine filled the silence, a steady reminder of his stillness in the face of chaos. Dave gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the entrance of the motel. The neon sign above flickered erratically, casting an unsettling glow onto the cracked asphalt below. He had been sitting there for nearly an hour, waiting, hoping that somehow he was wrong. But deep down, he knew he wasn't. The truth was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. Then he saw her. Laura's car pulled into the lot, and his chest tightened. She stepped out, dressed casually, her movements deliberate but unhurried. She paused to glance around, her face lit for a moment by the neon glow. Dave held his breath, his heart pounding against his ribs. For a fleeting second, he thought she might turn back, that she might reconsider whatever it was she was about to do. But she didn't. Laura walked straight toward the door of room 214. Dave's grip on the wheel tightened as she knocked, the sound inaudible from where he sat, but reverberating in his mind like a gunshot. The door opened, and there he was. John. He smiled, stepping aside to let her in. Laura didn't hesitate. She disappeared into the room, and the door clicked shut behind her. Dave's world seemed narrow, the edges of his vision blurring as his focus locked on that door. He wanted to move, to throw open the car door and storm inside, to demand answers, to scream, to rage. But he didn't. I wanted to burst in, his thoughts churned, frantic and uncontrollable, to demand answers. But all I could do was sit there, frozen, as the truth unfolded before me. The neon sign buzzed and flickered again, casting a harsh light on the empty lot. He sat back, his breathing shallow, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. Why had she done this? Wasn't 20 years of loyalty and love enough? Enough? The silence around him felt deafening, each second stretching into eternity. Or, then, headlights pierced the darkness. Another car pulled into the lot, its tires crunching over gravel. Dave frowned, his eyes narrowing as the car came to a stop. His breath caught when he saw Sandy step out, her face a mixture of determination and panic. What is she doing here? The thought barely had time to form before she started walking toward room 214. Dave's pulse quickened as he watched her stride across the lot, her footsteps purposeful. She reached the door and pounded on it, her fist connecting with the wood in a way that made Dave wince from his car. The door opened, and Laura's face appeared, pale and startled. Sandy's voice carried across the lot, sharp and cutting. "What the hell is this, Mom? How could you do this to Dad?" Laura's expression twisted, a mix of guilt and anger, but she didn't respond. John appeared behind her, his smug demeanor only fueling Sandy's fury. "You need to leave," he said, his voice calm but condescending. Sandy ignored him, her focus solely on her mother. "I can't believe you," she spat, her voice breaking. "You're throwing everything away for him? For this?" From his car, Dave watched it all unfold, his body rigid, his mind torn between stepping in and letting it play out. His world was unraveling before his eyes, piece by piece, and this time, there was no stopping it. Dave moved through the house with a quiet efficiency, packing the last of his belongings into a suitcase. The once familiar walls felt foreign now, stripped of the warmth they had held for 20 years. Each step he took echoed in the emptiness, the silence broken only by the faint sound of Laura and Sandy pleading in the background. "Dave, please," Laura called from the doorway, her voice desperate, cracking under the weight of her guilt. "It wasn't serious. It didn't mean anything." He paused for a moment, his back to her, his shoulders rigid. Slowly, he turned to face her, his expression calm, but his eyes betrayed the storm raging within. "It meant everything to me," he said, his tone even but laced with pain. Laura's face crumpled as she stepped closer, her hands reaching out as though she could pull him back, make him stay with a simple touch. "I was confused," she stammered. He just made me feel—" "Don't," Dave interrupted sharply, his voice low but firm. "Don't try to explain it. Don't try to justify it." Sandy, standing a few steps behind her mother, wiped tears from her face. "Dad," she said, her voice breaking, "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I just wanted us to be happy." Dave's gaze flicked to her, softening for a brief moment, but even as his heart ached for his daughter, the weight of their betrayal pressed down harder. "I gave you both everything," he said quietly, his words deliberate, cutting through the room like a knife. "I loved you, I trusted you, and you destroyed it all." The repetition hung in the air, each sentence landing like a blow. Laura sobbed, collapsing into the arm of the couch, while Sandy stood frozen, her face a portrait of regret and anguish. Dave turned away, zipping his suitcase with a finality that left no room for argument. He picked it up, carrying it toward the front door. Laura scrambled to her feet, following him, her voice rising in desperation. "We can fix this. We can move past it. Please, Dave, don't do this." He stopped at the threshold, glancing back one last time. His voice was calm, measured. "Some things can't be fixed, Laura. Some things shouldn't be." And with that, he walked out. Before he left, he placed a plain envelope on the kitchen table. Inside, the damning photos rested alongside a short letter. It wasn't angry or vengeful. It simply said what he couldn't bring himself to say aloud. "I loved you. I believed in us. But love without trust isn't enough. Goodbye." As he pulled out of the driveway, the house grew smaller in his rearview mirror. The memories it held, the laughter, the warmth, the love, felt like they belonged to a different life, one he could no longer claim. His heart was heavy, but for the first time in weeks he felt something else too, a strange and quiet relief. He had given them 20 years. They had given him lies, and now he was walking away. The day had arrived. But something was off from the start. The venue buzzed with nervous energy as guests murmured among themselves, glancing at their watches and exchanging confused looks. The ceremony was running late, far too late. Sandy paced in the bridal suite, her white dress trailing behind her, her perfectly styled hair beginning to fray at the edges. Her phone was clutched tightly in her hand, but the screen remained dark. She turned to Laura, her face pale and panic-stricken. "Where is he?" she demanded. "What if he doesn't come back?" Laura, seated on the edge of a chair, looked up, her face equally drawn. She had been twisting a tissue between her fingers for the past hour, her nails leaving faint imprints on the soft paper. "He wouldn't do that to us, would he?" Her voice cracked, the confidence she tried to muster faltering under the weight of her own doubt. The room fell silent except for Sandy's shallow breaths. Every passing minute felt heavier, the oppressive quiet pressing down on them both. Laura's words hung in the air like a cruel taunt. Neither of them believed them, not really. Outside, the guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the once pleasant hum of chatter turning into an audible undercurrent of speculation. Dave stood near the back, leaning against a tree, watching the scene unfold from a distance. He hadn't planned to come, but something compelled him to see how it all played out. "They looked as lost as I felt," he thought, his eyes scanning the frantic movements of the wedding planner and the whispers among family members. But their chaos wasn't my burden anymore. Another 20 minutes passed before Sandy finally made the decision. Her face was a mask of forced composure, but her trembling hands betrayed her. She turned to Laura, her voice brittle but resolute. "We can't wait any longer. I have to go out there." Laura nodded mutely, tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't say anything. What could she say? But the regret and shame in her eyes spoke volumes. Sandy stepped out of the suite, her heels clicking against the tiled floor as she made her way toward the ceremony. The music began hesitantly, the string quartet struggling to find their rhythm, unsure if they should be playing at all. The guests turned their heads, eyes widening as Sandy appeared at the end of the aisle, completely alone. She paused for a moment, her chin trembling as she looked out over the sea of faces. Then she began to walk, one shaky step at a time. The aisle stretched out before her like an impossible distance, every step more painful than the last. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over as she reached the halfway point. Her hands gripped her bouquet tightly, the flowers shaking under the force of her grasp. Each tear that fell seemed to echo in the silence, the weight of the moment crushing her as she walked forward. From his spot under the tree, Dave watched her. A part of him wanted to step in, to offer her the strength she so clearly needed, but he stayed where he was. This was not his moment to fix, not anymore. When Sandy reached the altar, she stood there alone, her shoulders shaking as she tried to compose herself. The officiant cleared his throat awkwardly, glancing around as if hoping someone would step in to fill the void. No one did. Sandy looked back over her shoulder once, her tear-streaked face scanning the crowd for a presence she knew deep down wouldn't be there. Then she turned forward again, her eyes filled with sorrow and resolve. The ceremony went on, but it was hollow, a shell of what it should have been, and as Dave quietly walked away, leaving the venue behind, he couldn't help but feel that the emptiness Sandy felt in that moment was only just beginning. Laura sat alone at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm mug of coffee. The house was quiet, eerily so, with only the faint ticking of the clock on the wall to keep her company. The aftermath of the wedding disaster lingered in every corner. Sandy had barely spoken to her, and the weight of her own choices felt unbearable. Her laptop screen glowed softly in the dim light. She hesitated before opening her email, her stomach twisting with unease. When she clicked on the newest message, the subject line sent a chill through her. "Thought you should see this. No name, no explanation, just an attachment." Curiosity and dread warred within her as she opened the file. The first image made her heart stop. It was her, laughing as she entered John's motel room. The next was worse. John's arm draped around her shoulders, his smirk unmistakable. Image after image painted the same damning picture, each one cutting deeper than the last. Shrugging, she pushed the image away with her hand. Each one cutting deeper than the last. Her breath caught, and for a moment she couldn't move. For the first time, she thought, her hands trembling, I saw myself as he did, a woman who had gambled everything and lost. She closed the laptop sharply, as though shutting it could erase the images burned into her mind. But it didn't stop the spiral of emotions. Shame, regret, anger. Who had sent the photos? Dave? Sandy? Someone else entirely? It didn't matter. What mattered was that the truth was now out of her hands. A harsh buzzing sound broke her thoughts. Her phone vibrated on the table, John's name flashing on the screen. She stared at it for a moment, then answered, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. "What do you want?" John's voice was calm, almost indifferent. "We've got a problem," he said. "My wife found out." Laura's breath hitched. "What do you mean she found out?" "She got an email," he continued, his tone darkening. "Same pictures, same story. She's furious, and she's already talking to her lawyer." The weight of his words sank in quickly. John's wife, wealthy and shrewd, had always been a looming figure in his life, someone Laura had foolishly dismissed as inconsequential. Now, she realized just how wrong she had been. Her thoughtful advice had turned out to be the catalyst that Laura had been waiting for. "She can't do anything, can she?" Laura asked, her voice rising. "I mean, she doesn't have proof of—" "She has enough," John cut her off sharply. "And the prenup she forced me to sign? Let's just say it's ironclad. I'm done, Laura. Financially, legally. She's taking everything." Laura felt the room tilt as his words hit her. "What about us?" she asked weakly, the desperation creeping into her tone. "What about everything you said?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line before John answered. "Us?" he said, his voice tinged with disdain. "There's no us, Laura. There never was. I've got to deal with this mess now. Don't call me again." The line went dead, leaving her staring at the phone in disbelief. Slowly, she set it down on the table, her hands shaking. The silence returned, heavier than before. Laura's chest felt tight, her thoughts a blur. John was gone, Sandy was distant, and Dave? He was never coming back. She was alone, truly alone, for the first time in years. Her gaze drifted to the photos on her laptop, still fresh in her memory. The woman in those images wasn't someone she recognized anymore. She had gambled her family, her integrity, her future, and she had lost it all. The house was quiet except for the low murmur of the television in the background. Sandy sat on the couch, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her husband, Mark, stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, his face etched with disappointment and anger. "How could you let it happen?" he finally asked, his voice low but firm. "How could you stand by and watch your mother destroy everything your father built?" Sandy's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. "I didn't," she started, but her voice faltered. Mark stepped closer, his expression hardening. "You knew," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You knew what she was doing and you let it happen. And now I'm supposed to trust you? How can I, Sandy? How can I trust someone who let that happen to her own father?" She sobbed. "Sandy, I have to do this. I have to help people, even if it means sacrificing my own father." Tears welled up in her eyes as the weight of his words sank in. She opened her mouth to protest, but the truth was undeniable. She had known. She had justified it, excused it, and stayed silent when she should have spoken out. "I thought," her voice broke as the first tear slipped down her cheek. "I thought it would be okay. I thought she was happy, and that would make everything better. I didn't want to hurt anyone." Mark shook his head, his frustration palpable. "And look where that got you. Your father's gone, your mother's a mess, and now you're losing me too." The words hit like a physical blow, and Sandy crumbled. "I've lost them both," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I lost my dad, and I lost him too, all in one day." Mark sighed, his anger softening slightly as he watched her break down. But the damage was done, and the gap between them felt insurmountable. He turned and left the room, leaving Sandy alone with her guilt and her tears. Dave stood in the backyard of his son's house, the smell of freshly cut grass filling the air. The sun was warm on his face as he watched the kids play with the frisbee, their laughter light and infectious. For the first time in weeks, the tightness in his chest had eased. Linda walked over, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She handed one to Dave with a warm smile, her presence calming in a way he hadn't expected. She was a widow he'd met through a community group his son had encouraged him to join, and their connection had been instant and easy. "Thanks," he said, taking the glass. "I needed this." She sat down next to him, her expression thoughtful. "It's funny, isn't it?" she said, "how life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it." Dave nodded, looking out at the children. "I thought betrayal would define me," he admitted quietly. "But meeting you, it reminded me that life is about second chances." Linda's smile deepened, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. As they sipped their tea, Linda's daughter, a young woman in her 20s, approached them hesitantly. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her cheeks flushed. "I know we just met, but I was wondering if you'd walk me down the aisle at my wedding. I don't have anyone else who could, and you remind me so much of the father I lost." Dave froze, the request catching him off guard. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. But then he looked at Linda, her eyes filled with quiet encouragement, and back at her daughter, whose hopeful smile was tinged with vulnerability. "I'd be honored," he said finally, his voice steady but filled with emotion. As the sun began to set, Dave felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. Betrayal had broken him, but second chances were rebuilding him. And for the first time, he believed in the future again. The soft glow of the desk lamp illuminated the room as Dave sat quietly, pen in hand, his journal open in front of him. The pages were filled with his thoughts, raw and unfiltered, tracing the journey he had been on for the past few months. The room was still, the only sound the faint scratching of the pen against paper. He paused, staring at the words he had just written. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing peace over bitterness." For a long time, he hadn't believed that. Forgiveness had felt impossible, a mountain too steep to climb. But now, sitting here, reflecting on everything he had endured, he realized it wasn't about absolving anyone else of their wrongdoing. It was about freeing himself from the weight of resentment. His thoughts wandered back to Laura and Sandy. The pain they had caused him was still there, but it no longer consumed him. He had walked away, and in doing so, he had chosen to reclaim his own life. The bitterness that had once poisoned his days was slowly being replaced by a sense of clarity and calm. Dave picked up the pen again and wrote, "I loved them, I trusted them, and they hurt me. But that hurt doesn't have to define me anymore." A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His son stepped in, holding an envelope. "This came for you," he said, setting it on the desk before retreating back to the living room. Dave stared at the envelope, his name scrawled on the front in Sandy's familiar handwriting. For a moment, he debated whether to open it. His hand hovered over the letter, hesitation mingling with curiosity. Finally, he picked it up and carefully tore it open. The letter was short but heartfelt, the words shaky but sincere. Dad, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need to tell you how sorry I am. I was wrong about everything, about John, about Mom, about what I let happen to us. I thought I was doing the right thing, but all I did was hurt you, and I will never forgive myself for that. Staggering with weakness, she entered back into the room and fell on the bed. You didn't deserve any of it, and if I could take it back, I would. I just want you to know that I'm sorry, and I miss you more than I can say. Nah, Sandy. Dave's chest tightened as he read the words, tears welling in his eyes. He set the letter down carefully, his hand trembling. He wasn't sure how to respond. Part of him wanted to call her, to tell her he forgave her, but another part of him knew he wasn't ready yet. Still, the letter was a step. It was an acknowledgement of the pain she had caused, and that meant something. It meant she understood now, in a way she hadn't before. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. The pain of the betrayal was still there, but it felt different now, less sharp, less consuming. He wasn't sure if he could ever fully forgive Sandy or Laura, but he realized he didn't need to decide that tonight. Forgiveness was a process, not a single moment. Opening his journal again, he wrote, "Forgiveness isn't for them, it's for me. It's choosing to let go, to move forward, to make space for something better." He glanced at the letter one last time before tucking it into the pages of his journal. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was a new chapter, a step toward healing for both him and Sandy. As he stood and turned off the desk lamp, Dave felt a quiet sense of relief. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer held him captive. He was moving forward, one small step at a time, and that was enough. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the outdoor garden. Rows of white chairs were filled with smiling faces, the air buzzing with quiet anticipation. Dave stood off to the side, adjusting his tie nervously. His hands trembled slightly, but it wasn't from anxiety. It was from the weight of the moment, the significance of what was about to happen. Linda approached him with a warm smile, her presence grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. She reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "She's ready," she said softly. Dave nodded, his heart full. Together, they walked toward the waiting bride. Linda's daughter Emily, who stood radiant in her white gown. Her eyes glistened with happiness as she looked at him. Her stepfather, for all intents and purposes, the man who had stepped into her life when she needed him most. "Ready?" he asked, his voice steady, but his emotions brimming just beneath the surface. Emily nodded, her smile wide and unwavering, more than ever. As the music began to play, Dave offered his arm, and Emily took it with confidence. They started down the aisle, the guests rising in unison. Each step felt momentous, a symbolic journey toward a new chapter in all their lives. Dave's heart swelled with a mix of pride and gratitude. He hadn't imagined himself here in this role, but now it felt like exactly where he was meant to be. The ceremony unfolded beautifully, filled with laughter, happy tears, and heartfelt vows. As Emily and her new husband exchanged rings, Dave caught Linda's eye from across the crowd. Her expression was soft, her love for him evident in the way she looked at him. He smiled back, a quiet acknowledgement of how far they had both come. After the ceremony, Dave found himself surrounded by family and friends, their congratulations and warmth wrapping around him like a blanket. Emily approached him again, her bouquet in hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything." Dave shook his head, his own voice catching as he replied, "Thank you for letting me be part of this." As the festivities carried on, a movement in the distance caught his eye. He turned, his gaze falling on a familiar figure standing just beyond the garden, Laura. She stood partly hidden behind a tree, her posture hesitant, her face a mixture of emotions he could read even from afar: regret, longing, and something else. Relief, perhaps, or acceptance? For a moment, their eyes met. Laura didn't move, didn't wave. She simply stood there, watching as Dave laughed with Linda and embraced Emily, watching as he moved forward into a life that no longer included her. Dave's heart stirred, but not with anger or pain. Instead, there was a quiet peace. Laura had made her choices, and so had he, and while their paths had diverged, he realized he didn't harbor resentment anymore. She was part of his past, a chapter that had ended. What mattered now was the future he was building. He turned back to the celebration, his focus on the people who mattered most. Linda reached for his hand as he rejoined the group, her touch reassuring. "Everything okay?" she asked. Dave nodded, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, everything's more than okay." As the evening stretched on, Dave felt something he hadn't in years, a profound sense of belonging. The laughter, the connections, the shared joy. It reminded him that life, despite its hardships, had a way of surprising you with beauty when you least expected it. Sometimes, he thought, as he looked around at his new family, the hardest endings lead to the most beautiful beginnings. The sadness and the loss is what makes life worth living. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of gold and crimson, Dave let himself fully embrace the life he had now. It wasn't the one he had envisioned all those years ago, but it was richer, deeper, and filled with the kind of love that came from hard-earned resilience. And that was more than enough.